I'm Mike. I'm here because Wayne Seltzer and I met at Vic's Jazz Jam, and Wayne and I started talking, and Wayne said, "Hey, I work with the Atlas Center, and it's really interesting. Maybe you should come and get to know people." And I said, "Sure." So I have some material that I could cover. I could also abandon my plans at any time. So, you should be aware that it's possible to veer off. There'll be some things that we might want to talk about, but I might just push through to get through some points. But, if it gets really interesting, we'll just stop.
So it's interesting because you got Michael Gleicher on there.
Mike? Yeah. So I worked with Mike at University of Wisconsin. Okay. And that was the first time I sat on a computer science dissertation committee. It was with Mike.
So when I was 23 or 24 years old, maybe a little older, but not much. I had this software company I wanted to start, and Mike was working at Apple.
Yeah.
And I went and visited him at Apple with my idea. And of course, I had no idea he was about my level. I thought, well, Apple, this guy's going to get excited about my software idea. Anyway, we've been on and off ever since.
He's a great guy, and I learned a lot about him. And I'll say a little bit about what it was like to collaborate with a computer scientist as a humanist. That word is kind of dated now, but it does have meaning for me as someone who's gone from higher ed into the cultural sector. I was director of the Folger Shakespeare Library for 13 years. That is the largest collection of Shakespeare materials in the world. It's next to the US Supreme Court. It's almost 100 years old. And it is a repository for about 350,000 rare books and 50,000 unique manuscripts created roughly between 1470 and 1700. So it's a very significant cultural entity. It's got a theater, a museum, an education program, a lot of digital programs, and several UNESCO World Heritage treasures. So interesting spot to be in, certainly in the last 13 years. As our politics and our culture have gone through several upheavals, and that's been a really interesting experience for me. But I did want to talk to you about the longer arc in my career. I started out as an English professor, and here's what I will plan to talk about. First, what did I learn from counting words in Shakespeare? And you already know my secret. I'm going to talk about 3 words and 3 words only: if, and but. And I'm going to put Shakespeare's plays in an if, and, or but 3 space. And we're going to talk about how they flock and part, what kind of partition you can create between them. Not high tech, kind of a toy example, but it connects to more significant issues. And then secondly, I wanted to talk about what it's like to ensure access to cultural materials today and in the future. I was lucky to work with Vince Cerf at the Folger. He was on my board, and we started to work on a project called Digital Vellum, which concerns sending or transmitting cultural materials potentially hundreds or thousands of years into the future. What are the issues connected with that? I'm less interested in the technical issues. Those aren't mine, but I'm very interested in the humanistic issue of what we preserve and how we interpret it over the long term. So that's where I thought we would go today. And let's start with the beginning, at least for me. I was an assistant and then associate English professor at Carnegie Mellon, which has an unbelievably high ambient level of computational thinking. As a humanist, my job was to read books and talk about them and potentially write about them, which I did. But it was an interesting place to go as a humanist because a lot of my colleagues would, when I said what I did, I'm in the English department, they'd say, "Oh, well, you teach grammar." And I said, "Yes, we do. I do. That's a very important thing. But I'm also interested in the content creation that happens on all your platforms. So without humanists and artists, your platforms don't do anything." And that was the best line I had for getting my colleagues interested in what I did. They tended not to be interested in what I did because they had a lot of interesting things that they did. But Carnegie Mellon had a 2-book tenure requirement and had 7 years to get that done. And my chair of my department, the person who was going to put me up for tenure, used to visit my office once every 2 weeks. Brilliant guy named David Coffer. Never read Shakespeare, was not interested in literature at all. He was a rhetoric person. And actually, I'm a rhetoric person too. My PhD is in rhetoric. And Dave would come in my office and say, "Mike, we're at CMU. We do a lot of computation. I think you should try using computers to interrogate texts. And I have a program that you could use. And he introduced me to a program called Docuscope, which is a massive text tagger and dictionary that encodes a text according to the rhetorical functions of the strings of words in it. It has a taxonomy now of, I think, hundreds of rhetorical functions. But when I encountered Dave, he was teaching with Suguru Ishizaki, they were teaching freshman composition using Docuscope. And he said, look, I think this contraption would be really great for your work. And I just thought, I have to write 2 books, and I don't know how I'm going to do that. So to kind of get him off my back, I handed him a disc. I said, here are text files for 36 Shakespeare plays. Shakespeare had 2 friends who in 1623, in the first folio of Shakespeare's plays, divided them into 3 groups. Please tell me what the groups are. So, you know, it seemed like a fair, they were unlabeled data. He'd never read them. And I thought, this is going to give me at least a year. Yeah. 5 minutes later, he's back in my office with a dendrogram that has beautifully sorted the plays out into comedies and histories. It's left the tragedies in the middle, but mixed in are a group of plays that we now call the late plays. They were identified in the 19th century, the late plays, the romances, and they were their own tiny cluster. So I thought, there are 2 things wrong with this situation. First, I don't understand how he did that by counting things because he has no domain knowledge. But the findings are aligning with the classifications of 2 people who played on stage with Shakespeare and edited his plays. So that's the first thing. And second, there must be something about language that I don't understand. As a humanist, there's a piece that is missing from my knowledge. So I started to play with Docuscope, and I told no one because my colleagues, I think, would have been very skeptical in English. We were very proud that we used traditional literary techniques, which are great, and I'd love to talk more about them. So I told no one. I got tenure, and then once I got tenure, I started publishing about counting things in Shakespeare. And that was the beginning of a really interesting journey. So I'm going to show you a view of a contraption created by Mike Gleischer and Eric Alexander. It's a text tagger called Ubiquity. It was sponsored by the Mellon Foundation at Wisconsin, where I taught for 3 years. And it allows you to download or upload dictionaries, or you can use Docuscope, and it will tag your texts. It'll give you the counts in a CSV file, and it will let you see the tagged items in the context of the text. So I did want you to have a look at this passage from Twelfth Night. We're not going to read it, but you will see that certain words, which I counted here, and, but, and if, can be turned on or turned off. And this is what allowed me to go from the findings to the in-context behavior of these words. And it's important. So the findings I'm going to discuss were really derived statistically, but the way you explain their significance has to have something to do with this. And this is an area where someone who does text viz was really helpful in getting us to pay attention to the right things, because you cannot read Hamlet and count or pay attention to every occurrence of the word if or but. You can't do it. Cognitively, it's a really weird experience. I've tried it. All right. So to talk about the ground truths, these are 2 friends of Shakespeare's, Heminges and Condell. In 1623, they acquired the rights to 36 of Shakespeare's plays. They published them together in a single volume, a large folio format, a prestige media form in 1620, which collected the works of Shakespeare. 36 plays. They had a catalog page here, which divides them into 3 groups by genre. Now, if you ask someone in 1620 what a comedy is, their answer will be, it is a play about lower class characters that ends in a marriage. That is the classic Renaissance definition. Now, if you go to Netflix, it's doing something a lot more sophisticated, but genre, or the sorting we do to types of story, is a very interesting human behavior. It's based on lots and lots of comparisons, and most people can't tell you why they think something is funny. So let's just hold on to that phenomenon. We're really good at discriminating types of stories, comedy, tragedy, drama, but we can't state the criteria that include or exclude. That might be where computation becomes interesting. Okay, so luckily enough, we had metadata from domain experts. It wasn't us, and my colleague and I, Jonathan Hope, could start talking about, well, this is an interesting convergence. We don't have anything to do with it. Now let's talk about why it happens. I want to now do a caricature of what Docuscope did. I do know the Docuscope patterns. I'm happy to talk about how Docuscope sorted the plays. But this was just an experiment. I thought people need to remember something. If and or but is pretty memorable. I'll just count it.
Just could you give like a 10-second description of what Docuscope is?
So Docuscope is a text tagger devised by David Koffer, Suguru Ishizaki at Carnegie Mellon. It is designed to highlight the rhetorical moves that are made by writers in texts. So it has a taxonomy based on a linguistic theory about how our language works that divides words into words that describe your inner life, words or phrases that describe social interaction, and words that describe the concrete world around us. Within those three types, there are hundreds of subtypes. So you can generate data from a text by scoring it according to these ever more refined categories. And that allows you to make further discriminations. But it should, because there's a good theory behind it, say, why are these texts behaving the way they are? So it's clever.
When was this originally devised?
Late 80s.
Late 80s.
Yeah.
I assume it's evolved to...
Oh, significantly. But Dave has an entire work environment that Suguru created so that he can refine his dictionaries. And he does now use AI to speed his ability to identify strings of text and say what they're doing. This is much simpler, okay? If you count the words if, and, or but in 36 Shakespeare plays and then put them into a 3-space that rates them on these. Humanists actually kind of like this diagram. It's pretty intelligible. Now, if we didn't have the ground truths from Heminges and Condell, these would just be dots. But we can identify the dots by genre and turn on the colors. And if I rotated this cube for you, I won't do that, you would see that the comedies and the histories are quite different. They almost never overlap. You'd also see that the tragedies are kind of mixed in there. And tragedy is harder to pick out. But our first finding was that the most obvious thing Shakespeare ever did was write history plays. He did it over and over again. It's a formula, a type of story that he created and introduced to the London stage, made very popular. And it's actually defining of his author signal. If you want to know what Shakespeare's style is, go to a history play. It overwhelms almost every other signal. Okay, so the question is, why are these two types of text non-overlapping? And let me just do a description of what the pattern is. You know, this pattern would be visible through PCA. You can verify it with ANOVA, but plays that have more and tend to lack if or but. And those plays tend to be what we think of as history plays. We can talk about that if you want. I want to talk about comedy. If you have lots of if and but, you tend to lack and you tend to be a comedy. So why would that be? If you think about comedy as a storytelling technique, you've got 9 actors, 2.5 hours, no flashbacks, no soundtrack. You've got to do it with words in the 3-dimensional space of real live actors. You have to create a story where 2 people don't get married for 4 acts. Now, how do you delay? Right? Because by the first act, they're, as you like it, you know, they're just in love with each other. Smack, Cupid's arrow hits, and that's it. But you can't let them get together. So comic plotting or writing is about delaying the consummation for at least 4 acts, and you do the delay by introducing confusion. Either through disguise, or there's some inner blockage, like I can't marry you because your father doesn't want me to, but you have to complicate it. And so you'll end up with lots of 2-person dialogue where people are saying, if you said that, then I said this, but you didn't. You'd call it a kind of storytelling that is about conditionals. Because you can't, in some cases, you can't even imagine the possibility that the person you love would love you back. That's one of the most interesting things about Shakespeare's comedies, is the characters love each other, but they absolutely are getting in their own way. And they need to be tricked almost out of their self-defeating behaviors. One of the ways they defeat themselves is by just living in the hypothetical or misinterpreting each other. If you said that, then I thought this, but I didn't, then blah, blah, blah. You want confusion and argument. So when I talk to humanists about this and they're looking at me with bug eyes and saying, why did you count these 3 words? Who cares? I say, well, now wait a minute. There's something about comic writing that we can describe now that we couldn't before, which is that it depends on conditions. Conditional love, conditions of assent or agreement, and counterfactual conditions like, would that you were my beloved.
But this is after the fact.
Pardon
How
me?
did you decide upon those 3 words?
Right. So I decided on the 3 words by chance because I wanted something memorable. It's really hard not to find genre. If you count anything, most frequent words, types of words, nouns, it's really hard not to see it. So this would be the humanistic translation of what I learned from a very simple toy example. And I would always want to go back and confirm this is from As You Like It, which, like a great Renaissance comedy, has 4 weddings in the end, but only after Rosalind gets out of her disguise and she sets up some conditions. I tell you 3, you're going to get married, and then I will marry you. I won't marry you if it turns out I'm not me, and you'll marry this other person. If. And so once she reveals herself as Rosalind, Duke Senior says, if there be truth in sight, you are my daughter. There's the recognition. Orlando, if there be truth in sight, you are my Rosalind. And he's been courting her as she was disguised as a man through the whole play. Phoebe, if sight and shape be true, why then, my love, adieu. Phoebe thought she was going to marry Rosalind because she thought Rosalind was a man. So this word is doing a lot for Shakespeare. In fact, he can't not use it when he's telling this type of story. That's a kind of constraint or affordance in language that is imposed upon this art form of live theater, because all you've got are words and bodies in 2.5 hours. It's done differently in cinema. And you can identify patterns in cinema too. But I'm just talking about the way drama works. So interesting that one of these tragedies clusters with the comedies, and that's Othello. Othello is very clearly a tragedy. It's a devastating play about a Black man who is deceived by his lieutenant into thinking that the white woman that he married is sleeping with another Venetian. What's interesting about this play is that if you ask if and or but what kind of play it is, it'll say that's a comedy. Well, if you think about it, Othello is a play about a seduction and an ongoing confusion. And it's not between Othello and Desdemona. They're married by the end of Act 1. It's between Othello and Iago. And the way Iago goes to work on Othello's mind is to throw out a set of hypotheticals. Well, if she were unfaithful with Cassio, it would look like this. It might be the case. And of course, that drives Othello mad. And then by the 3rd act, we have a scene where Othello is kneeling to Iago, his deceiver. And we call that the marriage scene, because he's pledged his allegiance to Iago over his wife. It's classic comic plotting. And it uses the same comic pattern. But that's an interesting insight because it tells us that Shakespeare was adapting a pattern he developed for comedy to great success. And he wrote a tragedy on top of it. And it is still to this day a play that people will stand up and interrupt because the terrible decisions that are made are so devastating. And the deception is so effective. So I wanted to just show you some part of the seduction of Othello by Iago. Iago is really good at if. And he says, I'm not telling you, this is how he creates trust. I'm not telling you that your wife is sleeping around. But if you just entertain the possibility, if she were, it would be with Cassio. And if it were with him, it would be because of this. And it's those hypotheticals that drive Othello into greater and greater trust of Iago. And we see that happening with the ifs in the play. Let's pause there and go to a significantly more complicated way of approaching the words. So you may know word tvec, which is essentially a word embedding procedure that has been deployed in R. About 10 years ago, we took word tvec and we created a model. I mean, again, this is a very small model compared to the kinds of models that are built for large language models, but it's about 1,048 plays written in the Renaissance. We create a model for it, and then we start to look for dimensions in that model, okay? Now, the dimensions can be words. So I can go into this high dimensional space and say, I want you to draw an axis between female and male. So it finds those 2 points, and then it can rate every item in the vocabulary along that axis. I can then project a different axis, and this one I call virtue and vices, and I've written the words here, but you can find a point between those words, and then also rate all the items in the model on that. Does that make sense? That little shorthand? Okay, we can talk more about it. If you do that, nouns become really interesting. Nouns almost always have cultural connotations. I'll start out with ethnicities, nationalities, and religious confession. I go to that point in the model and I say, I want you to show me 35 items and their relative location that are connected with nationality. And now I want you to rate them according to these 2 axes. So my intuitions as a domain expert are confirmed by this because I see that the most female nationalities are the Savoyard, the Spanish, and the Frenchman. In England, you can't get through a play without hearing someone complain about the French people and all their fancy costumes and hats and perfumes. You can't. English people are obsessed with the feminized elaborateness of the Italians. On the other side, the hypermasculine nationalities, pirate, Turk, Jew, these are the ones that are coded as threats within English drama, and they are also, especially with the pirate, considered to be male. Now these models are interesting, and we could go through and ask why the Pollander is somewhat below the Scotchman. I don't think I want to try. But now if we look at vices and virtues, of course, Turk and pirate, this is non-Christian and pagan and criminal. On the left and on the right, we get Europeans with the Venetians scoring highest on virtue. Why am I showing you this? I'm showing you this because as a humanities person, I try to be aware of the connotations of words because I know that a writer like Shakespeare is always expecting the audience to react to those connotations. We can't reconstruct completely what those association networks are, but we can use large language models and WEMs to understand maybe what the closeness and distance are between concepts. So what I see here is culture. And what is culture? Culture is the desire to sort entities, and it happens almost instantly. It happens over and over again. It happens in life decisions, in economic decisions, in political decisions. It happens with words in literature. So just an example of something that happens in Othello, animals are almost the most connotatively rich. You know, animals, flowers, nationalities. These are really highly associated words in our language, especially in this period. So again, female, male on the x-axis, but now Christian and non-Christian on the y-axis. It makes sense to me that I see lamb on the far left associated with Christian. Christian theology says that one of the members of the Trinity, Christ, is the Lamb of God. That is repeated over and over again. On the non-Christian side, most to the right, wolves, cubs, monkeys, and goats. Now, as someone who's read a lot of early modern literature, I know that monkeys and goats are some of the most sexualized animals. If you mention those animals, you are talking about sex. And interestingly, right, it's just, that is what is, I mean, if you're not talking about a farmyard, right, you're in a play about courtship. So when those words happen, they're happening not because there are animals in the henhouse. That's happening because someone wants to say something culturally. Goat, the most masculine. Monkey, the most feminine. One of the things that Iago does to taunt Othello is to say, your wife and Cassio are like goats and monkeys. They can't not have sex. They're going at it all the time. And he says, this might be true. Just imagine for a moment that it might be true. It's so terrible, you probably don't want to imagine it. But of course, he's put it in his mind. And when the ambassadors come to Cyprus, and Othello has already pledged his allegiance to Iago and has essentially already lost his mind, he blurts out the phrase goats and monkeys. So what I would say here is when Shakespeare wrote that line, he's thinking, I know what people will associate these animals with. I know why Iago said it. Now I'm going to have Othello say it to confirm that the bug is already in his mind. Great example of what we would now call, I'm going to shift a little bit, implicit bias. If you look in these models, even, I mean, unsupervised ways would be the best, you find that gender, sexuality, religion, and race are powerful axes that force nouns out of the middle. And my dream would be to come up with a way in an unsupervised fashion to really give a ranked account of the forces that are most active culturally in sorting different domains of language in the period. I think it's something we should do. And I think, at least in my field, in Renaissance studies, scholars like Kim Hall, Ayanna Thompson, Margot Hendricks have for decades been saying that skin-based racism was a reality in the 16th and 17th centuries, which is at odds with the standard account, which says that it really started in the 18th and 19th centuries with the medicalized accounts of races that developed in Romanticism. Very clearly, they were right, without a doubt. But it's, and they don't need this model to say they're right. I'm already persuaded, and they were effective at persuading people. But it's interesting that we can describe why they're right in a new way using computation. Okay, we're going to pivot to digital vellum. In the Folger Shakespeare Library, there are thousands of documents that are over 500 years old that were created using animal skins. Vellum is the processed skin of an animal. It's very smooth. If it's the younger the animal, the smoother the leaf. If you want something to last for over 500 years, write it on an animal. And our libraries are filled with animal skins, which are great indices of the genetic diversity of European animals. They're also dated, and they're usually taken from flocks that are related. But one of the things I learned when I was at the Folger was, first, animal skins last a long time. And second, there's a lot of data in the biological aspects of books, including the human DNA that's been dropped in those books. If you think about survival of cultural materials, at the Folger Shakespeare Library, there are hundreds of scholars who come to write the history of Europe and the Atlantic from roughly 1470 to 1700. A really important period in Western history because it marks the rise of mass communication and print, of science, eventually through the 17th century, of colonization, of international commerce, of risk and statistics, of banking, insurance. Those formations, which are basic to the modern, quote, modern world, are unearthed in that period. So if we stored all of that information that we've been working on as scholars on digital media, we would know nothing, because digital files don't last. They certainly don't last as long as column. And I was lucky enough to work with Vince Cerf, who was a member of my board, who has been thinking about this, but together we've been trying to understand what should happen if preservation by accident is not an option. I mean, most of what's preserved in terms of vellum in old books is there because someone ignored it long enough for it not to be destroyed. Preservation of everything is a bad idea. Just think about preserving all the pictures on Instagram for 1,000 years. The environmental cost of that would be insane. So there has to be a way somewhere in the middle there where we decide what it is that needs to be transmitted. And I started to think about that as director of the Folger Shakespeare Library. When I arrived, we had the best-selling, still do, best-selling high school edition of Shakespeare's plays, the Folger editions. You probably read them in high school, if you did in this country or in North America. And if you have children, they almost certainly are reading this edition. When I arrived in 2011, they had sold in perpetuity the digital rights to the Folger Shakespeare to their publisher, which was discouraging because I knew that people would use these texts. So I had the opportunity to talk with the VP at Simon & Schuster, Jonathan Karp, and I said, Jonathan, I think that what you're selling in these little editions is the footnotes, but I don't think the text is really something that is a saleable commodity. Let's make it available for free. And he said, that sounds like a lot of risk, but if you want to take it, go right ahead. So we then deeply encoded all of Shakespeare's plays in a way that allows them to not only be viewed and reviewed, but allows them to be downloaded and mixed up for actors or for directors who want to cut them. So 8 million page views last year. For a cultural institution, 8 million page views is really good. It is a massive source of traffic, and we didn't lose sales. But our goal was to create the most digitally fungible literary text in the world and make it reproduced and let lots of people download it and use it. So they've created an API, which you can go play with. It allows you to see all the lines of a particular character. It allows you to see only certain scenes. They even created a script called the Wit script, which is because I asked for this thing. Show me all the lines that Polonius hears when he's on stage, because I want those as a text file, and I want to think about what certain characters hear, not what they say. So they created this very clever Wit script. And if you go to folgerdigitaltext.org API, you can play with that. After seeing that people really wanted to interact with the text digitally, the next problem was, how do we get them to actually interact with the artifacts? And at the Folger, all of this material, 20,000 linear feet of rare books and manuscripts, were 2 stories down in an underground vault. And the crown jewel of the collection, which was 82 copies of Shakespeare's first folio, published in 1623, were almost never seen. So we undertook an $81 million renovation that started in 2020. 2020, actually, this is a little, the dates are wrong. We started just before COVID. And we opened, I say we, I'm no longer the director. It opened at the end of June, and I retired on July 1st. Happy with the work that we had done, but we did succeed. And now thousands of people come, and we put all 82 first folios in a visible vault in the entry so that people can interact with this book and learn about them. Every one of them is unique, actually, because they corrected it as it was being printed, and they didn't throw away the incorrect pages. So every first folio is a random collection of correct and uncorrected sheets. We do know what the ideal version would be now, but that was done through comparison and philology. So the idea was, how can we make the arts, history, and memory a civic resource? How can we build a modern museum underneath a civic landmark that has a Renaissance theater and a reading room and all the places that we use to engage scholarship? The location of the Folger, I think, is significant. It is a institution dedicated to the arts, to the history, to poetry and music, and it is right next to the US Capitol. That's very meaningful for me, because as we create a multiracial, multicultural democracy in this country, the need to have the resources of poetry, history, theater, language, and music is essential. It's part of that process of creating dialogue and understanding. Now, as I think about what to do in terms of creating access, I'm very interested in the first folio because it's a very successful piece of media. It's created in 1623 by two friends of Shakespeare, and essentially they say to the reader, they put this in the introductory matter of the book, we want these stories to survive. This guy was really good, and he's our friend. And in the opening paragraph to their address to the readers, they say, this is a really important book. You've been waiting for it for a long time. Now you can get your hands on, which is great, but please buy it. Buy it first, is to say, but whatever you do, buy. So for a cultural artifact to survive, it has to be loved, bought, or preserved. And what's interesting about the first folio is that two people who knew Shakespeare well said, we want to make sure that this object is addressed to the future, and we know why it will survive. It will survive because the plays are loved and because people buy it. First folio went through 4 printings in the 17th century, and there are hundreds of these books. A third of the first pressing, 1623, are at the Folger Shakespeare Library. If we back up and we start to think about cultural material and how we save it, there are 2 philosophies about that. So the first is preservation, which is, I'm going to draw a ring around a set of carved cultural artifacts in digital form or physical form, and I want to make sure that they are accessible. It is a very tough thing to think about what someone 500 years from now might want to do with an item. Like when they created the first folio, they didn't think Witmore would be taking something called a computer and reading the words if, and, or but it's a significant and reasonable use case. It just wouldn't have been preserved for that reason. So you need to have a very wide view of what people might do with an object. But it also, on the principle of the first folio, it helps if you tell people why it's important. And so the metadata that we have for describing cultural materials, which is derived from archival work in the libraries, is very good at, in a way, saying our best guess is these are the search terms you might want to use in pulling this item up. But it's different from putting a message in a bottle and saying, open me, here's why. And the magic of the first folio is that for 400 years, generation after generation has opened the bottle, taken the plays out, and in some weird way, they feel like, hey, it's addressed to me. That's the magic of incredible artistic creation, but it's also the magic of preservation and intentional saving of cultural artifacts. So my last word here, and then I'm happy to stop and would love to hear your thoughts, is there is probably a difference between sending cultural materials ahead and simply preserving them. And if you've read Cixin Liu's 3-body trilogy, at the end, the Museum of Humanity is an attempt to identify, single out, and preserve for at least 500,000 years a certain amount of culture for the future. I'm not sure we can do that. I'm not sure we should do that, but I do think we need to think about the to the reader letter and what an active role would be for preservation. Because if it's not active, it's probably not access. Stop sharing. I would love to hear your thoughts.
That was wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It really was. I don't want to be the first one to speak, I'm just.
You're speaking, so you should go.
No, the thing I mean, I have so many questions I have to control myself. I couldn't help thinking about AI, large language models the whole time. Then you put up that 3D thing, and I'm sort of locked onto this idea that, AI is like the 5th version of information technology for humans. The first 4 being speech or language, and then writing, and then printing, and computing, and now AI.
That's good.
The thing I like about printing is the history of printing is accessible to us. And that was very disruptive,
Couldn't agree more.
right? But then, the folio being preserved as a function of printing,
Absolutely.
and what the printing press was around 1450, and that was,
It takes till about the
Couple hundred years.
1560s or 70s for London to really get
Yeah.
up and.
yeah. And then also, the other thing that I think is great, there's a lot of, concern about AI, and things like, how do we preserve the human in AI? And I love the fact that you declared humanist, or used
Declared
to
I'm a declared humanist.
use, the technology to, illuminate Shakespeare. I mean, I could go on, but it's just precious.
Well, I really appreciate that, and I was really curious of what this group would think of the work I do. You have technologists, you have artists, you have people doing deep thinking about computation. I love all of that. And with respect to the history that you just gave of human communication forms and technology. So I agree with your history. I like that a lot. I'm not sure I'd put computation in there, but I'd love to hear that argument. But I would say that the revolution of the printing press was the first major media revolution that we have documented. It unleashed a huge amount of conflict.
Like the Reformation.
The Reformation said every person is part of the universal priesthood of all believers, and your opinions matter. Please publish them. So 2/3 of everything printed in the 17th century is religious, and a lot of it's testimonial. When you let people express themselves, they say things that really annoy each other. And I would say, if you look at social media, the more people we realize, everyone wants to get connected. Once you really connect people, you realize they can't stand each other. But the printing press is a great example of an invention that created huge possibility in the forms of shared knowledge. Scientific communication is very important, but it also introduced conflict that we are still experiencing. I mean, the radical Puritans who came to New England and created what many have argued is a highly religious nation. The fissures between fundamentalist religion and secular culture in the United States are still massive. So thank the printing press as well as John Calvin. Yes.
I like the idea of preservation and the digital age we have today. To me, was really interesting, and you kind of touched on it before. Where you're it's kind of unrealistic to preserve everything on Instagram for another 1,000 years. But then I kind of wonder what kinds of things do you think do you think from today will get Shakespeare was preserved today? What kinds of things from today do you think will be preserved for the future?
Well, I think that's a really important question. And I thought about it as a person running a research library, and with my colleagues who are incredible librarians. They have great resources, and they really are making decisions. When someone dies and they have an archive, So for example, Vince Cerf's archive will go to the Library of Congress. Every email he's ever written will be searchable for as long as the Library of Congress is around. That was a decision by a librarian. So that's on the intentional side. On the accidental side, who knows what servers will be buried and found, right? And what will be retrievable. There's probably something in the middle. And it was interesting, I was talking to Sarah about this. If you leave the decision with technologists and corporations or with librarians, you would get one outcome. But if I started a YouTube channel and just started interviewing people, like Gen Zers, what would you say? What I would get from them would be the message in the bottle that's attached to the bottle. And I think it's very important to ask people what they want to say, because that information has a huge amount of cultural significance that people thought, that is a highly intentional act that is not constrained by economics in the first instance, where you say, if you ask me 5 things to save for 1,000 years, I'll tell you, it's this Beyonce tune, it's this Constitution, you know what I mean? Like, if 20 million people say that those things are important, you've learned a lot about September of 2024, and a cultural historian is going to want to hear that. So, I guess I'm interested in the more interactive, and generationally as a Gen Xer, I think I'm probably not as mindful or aware of the power of social media to start accumulating metadata and choices, but I'm being very quickly convinced that that could be a really important resource for cultural history.
I'm still fascinated by the example you gave with regard to Othello, because you said, if I understood it correctly, that it's somewhat of an odd bird because it is deemed being a drowned?
It's clearly a tragedy, but it almost always clusters with the comedies.
Exactly. And I was wondering if there's some kind of problem, so to speak, that it might be interpreted as the style of Shakespeare. So where does the general style, like in the case of thinking about art, impressionism, when Monet paints in a certain way, that this overlaps or somehow contradicts or explains? I don't know, I'm confused to realize, but it explains this, let's say, at first sight, counterintuitive positioning in the metrics you showed us.
Well, I have two thoughts about that. The first is I didn't make that up. There was actually a reader at the Folger Shakespeare Library, a wonderful scholar named Susan Snyder, who in the late 50s wrote a book saying, I think Othello looks a lot like a comedy. And she was hugely persuasive because she went to that scene in Act 3, which is very clearly a seduction. And if you ask Docuscope what a comedy is, there's a much richer answer. Comedies have a lot of no, not, never. They avoid the word the, but they love the word and some. So the dialogue, and there's a lot of I, you, and there's almost no we, which is great, because comedy is the story that delays we until Act 5. It's absolutely right. But the sustained confusion and indefiniteness of confusion, if I actually clearly state the problem, we're all going to figure it out and it'll be done. So comedy requires the sustained mutual misunderstanding and dancing. So some, no, not, never are really good for that. I think the genre signal is really clear. The author signal is only the product of a profile of all the available plays that we have for a writer. So since most of Shakespeare's plays are history plays, and it was the genre that he almost invented, it's kind of reasonable to say that the history signal would be also the Shakespeare signal. And I think that's interesting because I actually don't think we can pry them apart. A writer's style is partly a function of the types of stories that they succeed with. And then at a certain point, Shakespeare is like, wow, these histories are doing really well. I need to write a history play like Shakespeare would write, and then you've got a style because the audience knows it.
Yeah.
So authorship is something that is visible. If I have a ground truth that says these 26 items are definitely Shakespeare, these aren't, get me the signal. Of course, machine learning can to the scene now. You know, like we know that in Henry VI, certain writers were writing particular scenes because we're able to use really good, rich resources of computing. To me, it's kind of like, well, okay, you know, I'm interested in identifying who wrote what, but I'm really interested in what they mean. So it's not really our problem in the humanities. Like, tell me which ones Shakespeare wrote. Just like it's not our problem, like, identify the search space so I can pick out the Shakespeare plays. It's like, I know the Shakespeare plays. We're looking for a more recursive kind of knowledge, but I think computer scientists, I'm just gonna like grossly generalize. But when I was working with computer scientists at Wisconsin, you know, and I would show them that slide of Othello and say, oh, it looks just like a comedy. And the scholar said it was a comedy. And one of my colleagues in computer science said, well, like, aren't you just practicing confirmation bias? And I said, absolutely. Humanities is organized confirmation bias. We're not testing hypotheses. We're looking for ever richer descriptions of why we feel the way we do. And when I read To Be or Not to Be, and I feel, you know, existential dread, like, why do you wake up in the morning? What do you do? I can describe it one way. If I'm going to let a computer in the room, I want it to describe that feeling. I don't want it to find Hamlet. You know what I mean? So it's kind of a counterintuitive collaboration. And that was a really important moment for me when I just had to confess, yeah, well, we do confirmation bias. Thank you.
I have something that's more of an anecdote than a question, although
Yeah.
unrelated question after. Back around the year 2008, I was embroiled in a controversy at this very large Southern university, where political factions were trying to affect, you know, higher education in ways that involve things like ending humanities departments.
Yeah.
No more English. Somebody actually had a quote that 20-some thousand papers have been written about Shakespeare. Why do we need even one more? That was actually spoken.
Yeah, no, at one point I heard there were more articles about Shakespeare than there were names in the Warsaw phone book.
Yeah, but you know, our great president of that university, who actually lost his job for his actions, he stood up and gave a speech and he said, you know, who can say how Shakespeare speaks to today's, you know, generation? You know, and that made an indelible mark on everybody, although it did eventually cost him his job. And I just want to mention that because it just shows how important this kind of work is.
Well, thank you for
Doing
saying that.
preservation, analysis, deeper understanding and relevance and all this.
Yeah, it's not like we're looking for an answer of the type that you're looking for in calculus. We're looking for a satisfying answer to a well-posed problem, you know, that works now. But Hamlet, as an encoding of human experience, is quite good at encoding a particular set of anxieties and longings. And it's been pretty good, like it's generated a lot. So let's keep generating.
Here's my question. So, I'm a video engineer. So naturally when you said the word cinema, my ears perked up.
Yes.
So I'm just wondering, is there work along these lines in the cinematic direction?
Tons of it.
Tons of it.
Yeah,
Okay.
you should read an article by Laura Mulvey called Visual Pleasure in Narrative Cinema.
I might write that down.
Yeah, Mulvey. And Mulvey, who's a psychoanalytic film critic, said in the 70s or 80s that if you look at classic Hollywood cinema, there are two types of shot. There's the over-the-shoulder shot, which invites the viewer to identify with the perspective of the person whose shoulder the camera sits on. And then there's the wider shot, which is meant to be looking at someone. And she said, and I think she's right, and it's been proven right quantitatively, Hollywood cinema alternates between the identification over the shoulder shot and the perspectival shot. And almost inevitably, the person you identify with is male, and the person who is looked at is female. And just that one piece of grammar for how films are made, the identification shot versus the wide shot, was reliably connected to a set of, what, as she said, patriarchal structures for how people are looked at or look at other people. And it was an incredibly effective article. She explained it in the language of psychoanalysis, but then quantitative film cinema studies people just counted the shots, you know? So that would be a good example.
It made me immediately think of James Bond.
Well, they are using the language of classic Hollywood cinema. So classic for her meant Hitchcock in that era.
So what was that title again? Visual pleasure?
Visual pleasure in narrative cinema.
Laura.
Mulvey. You'll have to have a high tolerance for psychoanalysis. It's fun. You'll be great. It'll be fun.
Okay. No, thanks for sharing. And when you were talking about the medium of preserving,
Yeah.
so I was working with the motion graphic professor in Taiwan before, and so he is working on preserving the Taiwanese opera, and
Yeah.
so at that time there are lots of filming, and so that's all. They are trying to film the opera with the film.
Yes, very hard thing to capture.
So, and he also said one sentence that I kind of resonate, like, so the medium of video for now is we can use like digital form, like see DVD or like USB, but it will all gone. See if we break or but only the film can preserve for a long time.
Celluloid film.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And okay, I heard.
Yeah, great point. It's the visual equivalent of vellum.
Yeah,
Celluloid. Yeah.
And here's my question. So, so because I'm like lacking of context of Shakespeare, so do you like any advice or recommend to how could I get in touch to say Shakespeare, because it's very hard for especially for like non-English speakers.
Yes.
Yeah.
So you have an advantage as a non-English speaker. Because you will pay attention to grammar explicitly in ways that native English speakers will not. And that's one of the things that frustrates native speakers about Shakespeare is the syntax is quite complicated. But because if you learn English grammatically with the help of a formal grammar, you have the tools. You're going to have to go slowly, right? But you will probably comprehend more in terms of the syntactical structure, but less in terms of the vocabulary. But that's okay. You know, the first time people read Shakespeare or see it, they probably get 20%.
Yeah.
That 20% is really good. Especially if it makes it easier the next time and you can get 30. I mean, I would hope to get 85% on a good day, 90.
Oh, I see.
But, you know, no one speaks this language.
Yeah. So how about which play or which act do you recommend to read or watch first?
Yeah. I would read Hamlet Act 1, Scene 2.
Hamlet Act 1.
Because it's a great scene that establishes the conflict for the whole play. And it has wonderful speeches that reward you if you really think about them. Why is this bad man saying this thing in this kind of weird way? Because he's a bad man. But the rhetoric and poetry is very revealing. So that would be my suggestion.
Yeah. So Hamlet.
Act 1.
Act 1.
Scene 2. Downloaded from the Folio Shakespeare.
Act 1. Scene 2. Okay.
I also recommend watching the movie while reading the words
Yes.
in front of you on a page, not necessarily super titled, and like rewinding, watching it slowly, watching it many times. I mean, I've had to do that and have this guy explaining to me what's going on. Not to be able to.
She does it for me for opera, but
Yeah.
Olivia.
Sure, yeah.
Okay.
Any good movie, but
But
read it and watch it.
I would say you're not at such a disadvantage.
It's hard.
Really?
Yeah. Yes.
I've got a question about this preservation, because for me, the interesting part here is, like, probably we should randomly select some things to preserve. But the thing is that, let's say with social media, probably if you preserve, I don't know, an image that someone shared without comments on the network, it doesn't have the meaning anymore. So this is an interesting, challenging problem for the data.
I think a stochastic sampling of items with surrounding contextual
Yeah.
media, that's the answer. Yeah, I like your comment. Thank you so much for coming.